Hi guys, so let's go glamping. This is my camping or glamping rock, if you will. And I started it off by sketching out what I wanted to do. There was an inspiration pic that I saw, and it was with a vintage camper and some dotting and campfire, but I did my own little riff on it. So I sketched it out first on the piece of paper, then I sketched it out on the rock. For those of you who are joining us in Shelly's group on Facebook for the plane ride, this is for the camping week. So the elements that I have put in mine are the campfire, the camper, the string lights, the stars and the moon, some shadows of trees, and that's about it. To sketch, I just used this regular old mechanical pencil and eraser and a soft makeup brush to get away my eraser shavings or what have you. The bottom portion that you see it right there is kind of my idea of some boulders. So I took a combination of a gray and a little bit of black, and I got my brush pretty saturated with water and tapped out a little bit, but kept it a little damp so that I could get a little bit of a swoosh effect going. So that's what I'm doing right here with the darker shade of gray that I created with that black. Just wanted a little bit of, kind of a movement of the rock. I didn't know if I was going to need to do some more coats on this. Normally I would have liked to layer it a little bit more, but as this dried, I ended up liking the look of it the way it was. So this was only one coat and then just some added detail work at the end that you'll see with some dotting and smudging with my finger. So now we're going to do a similar technique, the same thing for the sky. I chose this darker blue and I added in a little bit of black into that one as well because I kind of wanted more of a night sky. First I tried it just with the straight blue, and you'll see on the rock it's just a little too bright for a nighttime sky. So that's why the black ended up getting added in. That's what we're going to do right here. Use a larger brush for a larger area on the rock, and then I'll get into the detail with a smaller brush as I go. So here we are just trying that blue straight away, and it's a little too bright for me. So we'll just deepen it up, no problem. And this is a blue by Shuttle Art. I'm not particularly crazy about the brand, but for this kind of application, it's fine. And this is a phthalo, I don't even know if I'm pronouncing that right, phthalo blue, phthalo, and mixed in with just a tad of black. That gave me that nighttime blue that I really wanted. Just like with the boulder on the other side of the rock, I didn't know if I was going to be doing some layering to deepen that sky, but again, as this dried, it had the look of the sky that I wanted, so I didn't bother layering in another color, even though that often gives more depth. In this case, this is all I wanted. I was kind of going for a folk art kind of looking rock, with the dotting not being too perfect or anything, and the shading not being too perfect, just a very casual feel. That tends to be the style I lean toward a little bit more. So that's what I did with the sky, just one single layer of that with the black mixed in with the phthalo blue, and it gave us that variation in color that I wanted and the night sky that I was looking for. So we'll just continue filling in that blue real quick. Getting in all those little crevices around the smoke that's coming up from the campfire. Needed a bit of a smaller brush for that, but we'll get there. Having the brushes with the water and the acrylic paint gives it that more textured, mottled look. rather than just painting solid without a lot of water in the brush, just the acrylic paint. Having it watery gave it a little bit more of a dimension that I liked. Not to mention it made it easier to get in between those little lines for my smoke. So we'll just finish getting in all around those areas. Finish out our sky. You'll notice that unlike most of my videos where I give you the list of supplies that I used, I didn't include one in this tutorial video, mainly because I didn't use anything other than the craft acrylic paints. That was all I used, other than a white gel pen for the Happy Glamper lettering that we do at the very end. Everything else is just with the acrylic paints, and you can use whatever colors you want to be using. So I didn't give you a supplies list because I kind of show them throughout the video, but again, pick what you have, use what you have, choose what you like. It really doesn't matter. The choice is yours. If you wanted to make this more of a daytime look, you could do that and not have the element of the stars and the moon that we're going to be putting in there. You could really make it whatever you want. If you wanted that boulder part to be a grassy hill, you would use greens instead of the grays. Make it your own. Just do whatever you want to it. Okay, now we're going to move on to the next component of our rock. And the next component for Happy Glamper, drumroll please, will be the browns. The browns are going to be the dirt area where the vintage camper and the campfire are. That's going to be just a pebbly, rocky kind of area that we're going to do. And I'm going to use 4 different shades of brown. And again, pick whichever ones you have. I chose to just kind of dapple each of these colors in on top of each other. I've never done it that way before, but as I got going with it, it worked. So I liked the technique. It gave the look that I was looking for the dirt campground area, and it just blended everything in really nicely. So what I'm doing right here is just picking those colors. I didn't know if I was going to blend them together. I was giving a little bit of thought. Maybe I will, maybe I won't. But now I just dab it all on, and you'll see how I'm doing that. It really, there's nothing to it. Started off with the tan, come in with another shade, not even cleaning off my brush in between because it's all going to be blending together. So we're just layering it until it looks the way I wanted it to look. Some areas needed a little lightening, some needed a little darkening. So away we go. A very forgiving way of doing this, and not having a pinpoint size sponge to sponge this the way I would ordinarily try to get a blended effect. I didn't want it too blended anyway, so using this small filbert brush helped me to just get it the way I wanted it. I think it worked. And when I get into those tighter areas, I do use brush strokes a little bit And then just lightly dab on top of those brush strokes so that it looks consistent with the way the rest of the dappling looks, for lack of a better word. I don't even know if that's the right word. I think it is. I just kind of dappled it. You know, dapple. Better than blob, right? No, I didn't blob it on. I dappled it on. That sounds much better. I don't know if you're one of those people who has to turn their rock around. I have to turn my rock around. So just turn it to where I needed it to be to get into those spots around our campfire. And then around our boulder, and then we'll bring it around the camper. Remember, if you're doing this rock for the plane ride in Shelly's group, get all exposed areas of your rock painted. So I did go down on the sides with each of those colors, whether it was for the boulders, the sky, or the dirt area. See, I'm brushing that on lightly just to get in that line properly, and then I'll just dapple right over on top of that with some more coloring to give it the variation that the rest of the dirt has. Not really worried about getting too tight in each of those lines because we are going to come back in toward the end with some sloppy dotting just to create more of a pebbly and rock area throughout the brown and the gray. So even getting in close to those tires, I'm not too concerned about that. Getting in as close as I can, obviously, but I'm not worried if there's a little bit of white showing because I will be covering that up with the sloppy dotting that we'll do. I call it sloppy dotting because, again, this is kind of a folk artsy type of feel. I'm not going for perfection. If I went for perfection, I wouldn't achieve it because I am far from perfect. So the sloppy dotting is perfect for this kind of rock and the folk artsy type of feel because you can just kind of be a little bit more haphazard. You don't have to be a pro at dotting or painting in general. Just have fun with it. That's the bottom line. I do really like that small filbert brush. I happened to pick that up on sale at Hobby Lobby about a month and a half ago or so, and it really has been already a very well used and well loved brush. All right, getting in those final little tiny spots, and then we can move on to the next part. I covered up the smoke lines a little bit, which is okay because when we come back over that, we're going to be doing a base coat of gray for the smoke and then some sloppy white dotting on top of the gray later on in the video. But the gray I will just pull through over that brown dirt or earth kind of area, and it'll be dry enough that it'll cover it just fine, and it won't matter that we painted over those lines. I'm just coming back over in certain parts where I wanted a little bit more dimension just to finish it off. A little bit of the dark, a little bit of the light, a little bit of the midtones. kind of partially blending them together, but not entirely, because I still want each of those colors to kind of pop on their own. But overall, give you that earthy type of look. All right, I think that's how I want it to be. Clean that brush off and moving right along. I love that glass board, by the way. Really easy to use as a palette. And just wiping it with a baby wipe to move on to the next color. The next part that I want to do is the logs for the campfire there. I want the brown to be a little different than the browns that we used for the dirt. So I took another color to mix in with that darker brown, and it's a dark red, also by Shuttle Art. It doesn't have to be Shuttle Art, use whatever you have, but it's kind of like a brick red, for lack of a better description. It's not like a bright red that we will use a little bit later on for another part on the trailer. This is a brick red. So I took a little bit of the brown and just the tiniest bit of the red, just to change up that brown a little bit. Make it a little bit more like a base color that I want for the logs. And that's what we're starting off with. We're starting off with a base color on the logs. Then I'm going to add in some layering of some black and a little bit of the darker, yet there's one shade darker brown than the one I just put out there. So we'll take the darker brown and the black, and we'll give it a little bit more of a log look. Some burnt areas of the logs would be a little bit darker. So we'll blend that with the dark in just a second. But this is just our base mixed in with that brick red kind of color into the mid-tone brown. Using the same brush, the small filbert brush. Letting that dry just a little bit, hopefully. And now here we go in with a little bit of black. And I don't want to really outline the logs. I just want to do it in certain spots. Just put that little darker color in certain spots. If you outline it, it's not going to look right. So I'm doing a little bit along one edge of it, and then I'll kind of pull it in. Just lightly pulling it in right there into the brick red and brown. Little bit of a shadow. I don't want to do that on the whole log because that will take away from the effect that we're going for. So moving on to the other log a little bit, pulling it in and blending it into that brick red and brown a little bit more. Just very lightly. I didn't have a plan going into this rock, by the way. And this was just kind of, let's see what happens. So I urge you guys to just give that a try sometimes. Just see what happens. I don't know all of the perfect techniques and everything to plan it out perfectly. So a lot of times I'm just winging it. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. In this case, it did. So happy accidents sometimes, you have those, and you just make them work for you. I wanted a little bit more tan brought into the log, lighten it up in a couple of areas and give it a little bit more depth instead of just the brownish black on top of the brick red brown color. Just try to make them look more like logs. The more layering you do, the more likely you are to achieve the final overall look that you're going for. That small filbert worked so far for me, but now I'm needing to get a little bit smaller. So I'm using a tiny flat angled brush to just drag a very, very sparse amount of black into certain areas. Not black mixed with the brown, just black. Some little lines in the logs, maybe a little knot we'll put on one part of it, some burnt edges, just more dimension, that's all. A little bit of coals around the logs. Take your time with it, there's no hurry, and if you make a mistake, you can easily have some Q-tips handy and dampen them and clean up your mistakes. Let it dry and then paint over it. Those logs are starting to take shape. So we'll clean up our area, let it dry, see if we need to change anything. Come back to it if we do. But right now I'm just going to let it sit and we're going to move on to the next part. The next part is going to be that gray background for the smoke that I was telling you about. I wanted it a little bit lighter than the one that I had. The one that I had is just a straight up gray. That's all they call it on the bottle. But I want a little bit lighter, so I added a little bit of white into it and just did our background for the smoke, which again will have some sloppy white dotting on the top of it that will give it that folk art kind of feel. And you wouldn't even have to add the white dots on the top if you just like it as the gray. You can let that be your choice as well. And that brown dirt is dry enough so I can bring that smoke down a little bit right on top of it without any issues. Get those little wisps of smoke on the sides. And I'm using a different brush there. That is one of the nail art brushes that I have. I don't know that it has a particular name. It was just small enough to get into that detail spot. Now, eventually that fire is going to have some orange, some yellow, and some red. But the orange is what we're going to use to base coat the fire, and then we'll come in with some teeny tiny walking dots of red and yellow later on in the video. But right now, I'm just going to use a very small brush. I think that's my flat angled brush, a tiny one. And just getting that orange in there as my base for all of the fire. all the flames. Just real quick, nothing fancy, just filling it in. Then we'll give more shape to the flames once we do the walking dots with the red and the yellow. So you'll see that in a little bit. Now I'm just putting out a little black, and we're going to paint our tires on our trailer. That's going to take a few coats to get it an even black that we're looking for. This is just the first coat. And I always jump around from spot to spot waiting for certain areas to dry. I didn't end up waiting for those black tires to dry enough. You'll notice in a little while that I do smear it, but that's okay. We can fix it, and we will. I always tend to walk away with paint on the sides of my hands. I don't know about you, but that's standard for me. I always seem to put my hand in something. Paint, that is. All right, then we're going to let that black set up and move on to the next part. I also added a little black to that tiny trailer hitch that you see right above the bumper. Bumper, or what would that be called? That's not a bumper. Anyway, the base of the trailer, how about that? Okay, so now I'm going to start with the door on the trailer, now that we have the tires done. I want it a little bit darker than that blue, so I'm going to add in a teeny tiny bit of black to get the shade that I'm looking for. The door is the darkest blue that we're going to use. Again, that flat, angled, teeny tiny brush is what I'm using. And there's a little window in that door, so I'm trying to be careful to go around that window. Right now it looks like a Pac-Man ghost, but we'll change that. No Pac-Man in this room. And I left a little dot of white there. That's going to be our doorknob. We will dot that with black in a little while. All right, there's our dark blue door. Those two shades of blue are what I have chosen for some striping that I'm going to have on the lower part of the trailer. That first one that I'm squeezing out is by Apple Barrel, and it's called Blueberry Frost. So that will be our top and our bottom blue lines, then with a lighter blue in between. again, the flat, angled, tiny brush is what I'm using here. It helps to kind of keep a straighter line for me. I'm really bad at straight lines. I didn't just eyeball those lines. I used a straight edge to create them because I'm that bad at straight lines. Oh, that was me pointing out where I smudged my black, but we'll fix it. All right. We're going to come back in with that lighter blue that will be in between those two lines after those lines dry for a little bit. So right now we'll leave those lines just like they are and move on to our next component. Our next component is going to be some light that's coming out of the trailer and through those windows, the window that's on the door and then the other window that's just to the right of it. I'm thinking at this moment that I'm going to do yellow with just a tad of orange to make it look a little bit like a glow coming out of the windows, but we're starting off with just the straight yellow. And then we'll lightly smudge in some of that orange. Putting the second coat on top of there. Could have waited for it to dry a little bit longer, but we're going to be blending that orange in anyway, so we want it slightly wet so that the orange will blend. Mixed a little bit of the orange in with the yellow off to the side, and then we'll just dab that on one side of the window. Not the whole thing, just one side of it, so it gives kind of a mottled effect. Same thing with this window. A little bit more yellow on that window that's off to the right because I pulled some of the pencil into the yellow, so it was a little dingy. So I wanted to brighten it a little bit more, so I added another coat of the yellow and then mottled in the orange mixed with the yellow afterwards. All right, now I'm putting out just a little bit of black, and I'm going to do some teeny tiny dotting with the black. Oh, first I'm going to do some lining. Forgot about that. We're going to do the lining first and then the little tiny dotting. So that, again, excuse me, is a nail art brush. Very, very fine lining brush that I'm using. And on the other end of that tool is a tiny dotter. So I'm using that same tool for 2 applications on the rock. We'll start with those little windowsills, which are going to be first with the black and then with some gray dots on top of them. There we go, we're coloring in that door handle I talked about earlier. Going to touch up the tires. Who said there was a smudge there? There's not going to be a smudge there anymore. It's gone. Using this fine liner art brush for the second coat of black really helped to make those circles a little bit more perfect on the tires. Now I'm using that black to create a line which will become my string lights. And we're going to use some dotting to create those lights themselves with some orange, layer on a smaller dot of yellow, and then layer on a smaller dot of white. And we'll do those hanging off of that black line or string or whatever you want to call it. Just lightly outlining the window, trying to keep it a little bit thinner than the window sill part. Outlining the door as thin as I can get. I don't know if you can tell in the video, but the thinness of that nail art brush is about the same as those disposable eyeliner brushes. So if you're familiar with those, that's pretty much the same as what this is. Now I mentioned that I was going to do some gray dots on the windowsills. I'm also going to use that gray to do the base of the trailer. Again, I don't know what that's called, what that base part is called. If somebody knows, feel free to tell me. But we're painting it gray. Is it a platform? Maybe platform's the right word. I don't know. And after this is closer to completion, we'll be making some silver hubcaps on those tires too, so they're not just going to be those black circles you see right now. All right, cleaning off those little paint dots, and I'm putting down a brighter red now. That brighter red, which is by Apple Barrel, is called Flag Red, and I'm going to use that to paint the curtains on that right side window. So they're going to be bright, cheery red curtains with white polka dots. because I had it in my hand and it was already ready to be painting with, I used the same brush. There I go, turning the rock again. Good thing that black paint on my hand from the tire is dry, otherwise I'd be smudging it in our sky. Because I do use my hand to balance as I'm painting. It helps to keep me a little bit more steady with the brush. Okay, so there you see the other side of that brush is that tiny dotting tool. And I'm taking a little bit of that bright red and coming into our flames. This is where I do those kind of free-flowing walking dots, defining a little bit more shape into those flames so it's not just one big orange blob. And it's almost, the fire that I made is kind of like a tulip shaped fire. And I'm kind of creating more definition for those flames with these red walking dots. Walking dots is just a way of saying what's happening with a quote-unquote walking dot is you're loading the paint onto your daughter one time and you're continuing to dot so that the dots get smaller in size as you keep going, as you keep walking the dotting tool along. If I wanted to keep consistent size dots, I would reload it after each dot. That way they would stay the same size every time. So I just put out a little bit of white, and I'm using that white to create our polka dots on our curtains. And I'm just doing random, I'm graduating down in size like I was just explaining for those walking dots, but I'm placing them on the curtains in a little bit more of a random fashion so that there are some big dots next to some small dots next to a medium-sized dot and so on. I was trying to decide if I wanted to outline the camper. So I thought, yeah, let's define it a little bit more. So I put out a little bit of gray. First, I'm going to do those gray dots on the windowsills with that same tiny dotter. And see how I'm reloading the dotter each time? That's because I want those dots along the windowsill to be the same size, as opposed to getting progressively smaller. Now I'm going up one size in the dotter. And on that gray platform, that was the word I chose to use to describe that base of the trailer, I'm going to do 2 rows of black dots. And I want them pretty much the same size, not walking dots. So I'm reloading the daughter each time. Again, this is a kind of folk art feeling kind of rock, and not a lot of realism to it, kind of more whimsical. And I just felt like doing the dots. You don't have to. I just felt like doing it. I thought it just added another little nice dotting dimension to the rock. All right, there are 2 rows of black dots. Now again, I decided I was going to give a sloppy-ish kind of black outline to the trailer, kind of a shadow, kind of an outline. Not really a shadow, no, more an outline. But I started with the daughter instead of the fine brush and thought, okay, well, I'm being lazy and I'm just going to use the daughter to finish that outline. And I'm just dragging the paint along. It doesn't need to be real precise. Nothing about this rock is very precise, so I'm just going with it because it's what I had in my hand. Probably should have switched over to the brush, but I didn't, so we're just going to keep going with it. It just adds to the whimsy, right? All right, we've got our little rough black outline on the trailer now. Now we're going to fill in that center wide stripe with the lighter blue. And that is just a sky blue. And we'll just fill that in now. We're getting closer, almost done. The dotting is what will just finish it off, those sloppy dots that I was talking about. And some dots for the stars, and we'll do a moon. We'll get there, but right now, sky blue for this wide stripe. And I went back to using that tiny flat angled brush, helping me keep those straighter lines. And get into the little nooks and crannies that I need to get into. Very light touch here, very little paint. Here we go. Now, what's next? Next, we are going to do some white dotting, the sloppy white dots in our smoke. These aren't perfect dots. I didn't want them to be perfect dots. I wanted them to have that folky kind of look. So I'm not reloading the dotter every single time. I'm keeping the dots a little bit more free form. They're not all perfect circles. Some of them are. Some of them are a little oblong. That's okay. I don't want this to be perfect. It's not like a mandala. I am trying to keep some spacing though, so that you can see each dot, independently, and they're not just turning into blobs. Then I went down to a smaller dotting tool to do a second row of dots along next to the bigger row, and to get into those smaller little swirls of the smoke and to bring it down to the fire. And those wisps on the side are both done with the smaller dotting tool. Just one row of dots for the wisps. That's hard to say, wisps. Again, I could have switched over to a brush. I was being lazy. And then I realized, yeah, Risa, you need a brush for this. So I am going to finish out the moon with a small nail art brush. And I have a lot of water on it, so it's a little bit translucent, showing a little bit of that blue through in the moon. Gives it the dimension that a moon would have a little bit more. And now I'm going to go back to another tiny dotter and just dot some stars throughout the sky. Now it's time to add some pebbly, rocky type of dots. Going sloppy on these too. Just in certain areas, under the trailer, over by the fire, along the boulder, coming down into the boulder a little bit. And then we'll do the same thing with the shades of brown and adding a little bit of white. And then I'll just smudge them a little bit with my finger. You can feel free to use a Q-tip instead of your finger. I just tend to use my fingers wherever I can. Somehow it's just not a completed rock until my entire hand is messy. The black does look a little stark on its own, but once we add in some dotting with the brown color, it will all mute and blend a little bit better. Some of the black will stay a little sharper, and that's fine. That's what I'm going for. Just a kind of haphazard, pebbly, rocky look. There we go, bringing in some gray too. Forgot about the gray. Just gives a little bit of depth to the dirt and the boulders. And those are all the same shades we used earlier. Nothing new coming into the rock yet, or at all. And I did the smudging with my finger because the dots were looking a little too perfect for me. I didn't want them perfect. I wanted them smudgy. So I even overlapped dotting with the different colors. I did a little bit of white on top of the gray, a little bit gray on top of the blacks. Same thing with the browns. They can all touch one another. No particular pattern here, just very random. Where the sky meets the dirt area there, I'm doing a little bit more dotting just to blend it and soften it a little bit, so it's not such a harsh line. There I go, smudging. Q-tip would work just fine too. Or a dry brush. Use whatever you want to use. Experiment. Just play with it. That's what I'm doing. Okay, now I'm going to put a little bit of silver on those hubcap, or on the tires, to create some hubcaps. Kind of bubbled out on me a little bit there. That's all right. And I'm using the biggest nail art dotter that I have. And I'm just creating a larger circle there with the dotter, and then a smaller one on the smaller tire. Once that dries, I'll put a little dot of white on top of those as well. While that's drying, I'm going to add the yellow walking dots to my flames. We already have the red in there. Now we're going to pop some yellow on top of the orange and in between the red walking dots. Pretty small dotter, one of the smallest ones, because I really want to get in between the red dots, and I don't want a dot on top of those. This is one area, probably the only area on this rock that I'm being a little bit more precise with the dots and keeping that walking dot formation. And this just adds one more layer of depth to the flames. That yellow is also going to be one of the colors we're going to use for the string lights. But the first color that we'll use for the string lights will be some orange. So as soon as we're done with these walking dots, we can come in and do our string lights. Same orange that I used before on the fire, and somewhat evenly spaced, oh, I'd say a mid-size dotter will do for this, and evenly spaced right below the black string or wire or line, whatever you want to call it, for the string light. So they're just kind of dangling off of that. And since those lights kind of, I envision a little bit of a glow to them, the yellow going right on top of it wet isn't as big of a deal. If I was doing a mandala, I would certainly want that orange to dry completely, but I'm not doing a mandala. So I'm okay with the color blending a little bit more, so it's okay that the orange is a little bit wet. I size down my dotter just a tiny bit and then come back on top of the orange dots with some yellow. And then I size the dotter down even smaller and we'll come on top of that wet yellow with some white. Again, if it all blends a little bit, that's just fine because that adds to the glow of the lights that I wanted it to have anyway. Just teeny tiny white on top of that yellow. So orange to yellow to white. Kind of looks like a candy corn there. Just notice that. Oh, right, it's not Halloween yet. All right, now I'm just using the straight white to fill in the rest of that camper with just random dots, the same way I did the white on the curtains. I didn't walk the dots, but I am letting them get gradually smaller. And I'm doing a big dot placement, then a smaller dot, then a medium-sized dot, and then reloading as I go and just filling in each little area with the white dots, random sizes until it's all filled in. And then I'm using just the teeniest, tiniest amount of white. You'll see in a minute. I just add a little bit of white to that doorknob just to make it pop out a little bit more. And then we'll be done with that and just adding our happy Glamper lettering. And we can call it done. No paint pens on this one. Wow! Just acrylic paints. That's it. Teeny tiny dotter on the doorknob. And teeny tiny white dots in the center of our hubcaps. Oh, what did I forget? Oh, the trees. I forgot the trees. very watered brush with just a little bit of black, and I'm just doing little black shapes of trees, not really paying attention to branch work or anything like that. I'm just giving the illusion of black kind of silhouettes of trees off in the very, very distant background. There we go. Now we're just going to use our Signo Uniball Signo gel pen, writing out Happy Glamper, and then we call it done once we put a coat of UV resin on. You'll see at the end what the finished rock looks like with the UV resin. Happy glamping, everyone!